Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guest today is Elliot Ackerman, author of Halcyon. It's published by Knopf, released a couple of weeks ago. The book has deckled edges, so you know it has to be good. Elliot is the author of the novels Red Dress and Black and White, which we talked about right at the beginning of COVID. He's also the author of 2034, just recently, Waiting for Eden, Dark at the Crossing, and Green on Blue, as well as the memoir, The Fifth Act, America's End in Afghanistan, and Places and Names on War, Revolution, and Returning. And his books have been nominated for the National Book Award. He is a prolific writer for periodicals like New Yorker, The Atlantic, New Republic, New York Times, Harper's, lots of others. So we all fear death. We all fear Trump. Well, at least half of us do. Same for DeSantis, same for Ted Cruz. At the bookstore, I have this sticker that says, it has a picture of Ted on it, and it goes, the caption is, "This man ate my son." And people seem to like it. But to go back to Elliot in the book. So what if we had an option to cheat death, to get a second chance to come back? In an alternate history that Elliot creates, you get that chance. And for good or bad, you get a Clinton conviction, a removal, a pardon, and then you get an Al Gore president for good or for bad. But the funny thing is, the key to the book is relationships. And even though there is that alternate history vibe, we are most concerned about the Civil War, or there is a big concern about the Civil War, Shelby Foote, James McPherson. And my daughter goes to the University of Richmond, so I know all about, in the book, big deal, monuments of Confederacy people being torn down. And I have mixed feelings about that, as perhaps Elliot does, and as two of the main characters in the book do. And, it's because, like, no one listens to anybody. There's a total lack of civil discourse. And Elliot riffs on that as well. And a bifurcation of American values that occupy a lot of our time and fascination in the book and in life. It's really scary. It's like, now it's scary, really scary. So let's talk about that. Welcome, Elliot. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me back.
Hey, so as a bookseller, the cover is the thing, plus the deckled edges. So show us the cover and we can talk about it a little bit because it's interesting to me.
Yeah, it's the cover. Yeah. Halcyon.
It's a really nice cover. The curvilinear letters are going to be attractive to people. But the thing about the cover is it's so bucolic. And that's kind of reminiscent of Halcyon, those Halcyon days of yesteryear, which I say jokingly to my children and grandchildren. So why Halcyon? Are you saying we're longing for this backward time when our mother would let us out of the door in the morning and we'd come back at night rather than staying in our rooms and watching our devices for 6 hours a day? Or are you saying something else?
Well, the book is, as you mentioned, is set in an alternate 2004 where Al Gore is president and we figured out how to cheat death. And so one of the people who has cheated death in this world is a guy named Robert Ableson. And he is a renowned Virginia litigator in his own time, now retired. And he lives on a pretty bucolic estate called Halcyon. And the narrator of the book, when we meet him, is living in Robert Abelson's guest house. So Halcyon, the estate, becomes really a metaphor in the book. Yes, it's a place, but it's also this sort of longing for better times, simpler times that maybe once existed or maybe never existed and only exists in our own nostalgia and imaginations. So that's how the title of the novel came into being.
That's interesting. I never thought about it, but a lot of what you talk about, especially the quote by McPherson, is the idea of history being a myth, and that the live people use the dead people to create history. And then I just thought about Halcyon. Like, I remember back, when things seemed really pleasant and everybody did talk to one another, but So yeah, I didn't really tie in the element of Halcyon with also with the mythological aspect of history. You
Mhm.
always think back, yeah, this was really nice, but was it?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and the word, I mean, Halcyon comes from Greek mythology. So it's a mythical bird that makes its nest out at sea, and it's a sanctuary. It's a space of sanctuary. But I think it's not that history doesn't exist, but there's the difference between facts and then the stories that we use to weave facts together into a narrative. And those stories can often be pretty disparate. So in the case of Halcyon, one of the central themes of the book is history and how we remember it and who does the telling. And the Civil War, our American Civil War, becomes a point of controversy for the characters in the novel.
It's funny, you can use cliches like Henry Ford saying history is bunk, or history is written by the winners.
Sure.
Um, and when I was living in North Florida for 20 years, everyone called it the War of Northern Aggression.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, so is that kind of all right? All right, I got to get you back to the book because we're trying to sell it. So when you have the main characters, Lucas, first Martin and Lucas, and they have completely different ideas, soft ideas a little bit sometime about, let's talk about the statuary. Let's talk about the monuments at Gettysburg with Lee and his 7 soldiers. Should they have been torn down? Should they be torn down? Is there a reason to?
What I'm doing in the book with a lot of these themes is I don't think any reader wants to hear an author come down, particularly in a novel, and be didactic and tell you what to think. What I'm trying to do is to allow the readers to sort of see these issues in different and in new lights. So one of the central points of controversy in this alternate 2004 is what's called the Virginia Monument, which is on the Gettysburg battlefield and is still there to this day. And it is a monument that was built where Pickett's charge began on the last day of Gettysburg. So, this bucolic photograph on the cover of the book, which at first glance looks very peaceful in a farm, you'll notice there are these sort of soft clouds, and that's gunfire. This is actually the Gettysburg battlefield, and it's a print made of it shortly after battle. So the controversy in the book is whether or not this monument should be torn down. And 2 of the characters, Martin, who's one of the narrator of the book, and Lucas Harlow, at least when you first meet them, have 2 different views about what should happen to this monument. And those are explored in the course of the book, along with other themes. But it's this idea, and looking at this idea of what are the stories that we tell about ourselves as a society, and how do those stories inevitably and always evolve. And so in Halcyon, what you see is a narrative about the Civil War, which has evolved in our own lifetimes, evolving in an alternate American reality to reach different conclusions than the ones that we've reached.
I know you have a passion about Pickett's charge, and rather than me talking about it, I know you have a good way of going about explaining the tragedy of it, the stupidity of it, especially given Fredericksburg. But why don't you talk a little bit about that? I think our listeners will be interested in that.
Well, I think one of the things that's just so fascinating in the Civil War, and this comes up, is that Pickett's charge, when it happens, and if a person visits the Gettysburg battlefield, which I have many times, the ground itself tells the story. So if you know anything about the history of Gettysburg, you'll know that in the Confederate Army, General Longstreet, who was Lee's deputy, desperately did not want them to make Pickett's charge, thought correctly that they were going to be massacred. And the reason he thought that was the Christmas before, in December, was the Battle of Fredericksburg, and the roles were reversed. So whereas at Gettysburg, the Confederate Army was charging across an open field against the Northern Army, at the Battle of Fredericksburg, the Northern Army was charging across a field against the Confederate Army, and the Confederates were dug in behind a wall, and they massacred the Union soldiers. And it was so bad that the Union soldiers were pinned down in December on this hillside, and in Virginia, and if anyone's spent any time in Virginia, you know this is very unusual, but that night the northern lights appeared. So the aurora borealis came out, which, I mean, I've lived in that part of the country for decades. I've never seen that happen. So it's very, very rare. And when the Union soldiers saw the aurora borealis going over their heads, they thought that it was the spirits of their dead comrades going up to heaven. And the Confederates, when they saw the aurora borealis, thought it was God himself celebrating a Confederate victory. But now we fast forward just 6 months into the future, and it's Pickett's charge. And so when the Southern troops crossed that field, the Union soldiers now, many of whom were the same survivors of the Battle of Fredericksburg, dug in behind a wall, started massacring them and were chanting Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg, as they killed the Confederate soldiers. So this is all, this is all in our history as a country. And it's very messy. And if you ever go to Gettysburg, you can stand and see the ground where this all happened. And so part of the novel addresses, how we remember stories like that, which I think there is, as you said, you used the word tragedy, and there's something tragic about it, just in so much as the loss of life. I mean, tens of thousands of people were killed that day, and the folly of it, particularly on the Confederate side in Pickett's charge. So the book, it brings the reader into those stories and asks questions about those stories as well.
It's funny, I know you've talked about it, but when you walk that field and you come up, because it's just a very shallow, slight slope, and then you see the wall. You can talk about that too, but what I was going to say was, I'd like to hear you talk about that, but all this reminds me of like the Charge of the Light Brigade, Gallipoli, or even you blowing out the back of the wall and getting the Silver Star. It's all this idea of like, you know what, I'm going over the wall, I'm seeing this, but ours is not to question why, kind of thing.
One of the things about Pickett's charge, and if you visit Gettysburg, that is very striking, is the contemporaneous accounts written by Union soldiers, where they talked about seeing the entire Confederate army step out from the trees to begin this charge. And charge is sort of not the right word, because they were walking most of it. It was a mile that they had to cover. And the Union gunners wrote about, wow, like, look at that. It's like a huge army on parade, like, pretty amazing. And they started firing on it. And as the Confederate soldiers were walking, they were going up this very gentle rise. So they couldn't actually see where they were going. And then there was a moment, and if you go to Pickett's charge and watch this, you can see it yourself. There's a moment where you finally get enough elevation in the rise that you can see across the field. And it's about a half mile to the wall that they had to go to, and that wall's still there. And the Union witnesses said that at that moment, there was an audible groan. Tens of thousands of people all at the same time kind of saying like, oh my God, like realizing how far they had to go and they were probably going to die. And so, those little details, just as someone, I'm a writer, but I'm also fascinated by history. They've always just resonated with me, as you mentioned, Sam, and the folly of war and the humanity of it, and that, in these historic moments that we're all, still reading about and learning about hundreds of years later, there are these little details like, the sigh of every single person who was on that ill-fated charge.
Fascinating thing about your life to me is that you've been through all of this yourself, 5 tours, and seeing a lot of the things that you write about, because almost nobody has that ability to put the two together, right?
Well, I think it sometimes the emotion of it, I'll just say the emotion of that, when I read those histories, it resonates with me, because there's something that it captures in my own imagination, because I can relate it to my experiences, not the causes, but just the experience of being a soldier, and what it must have felt like to be one of those Union soldiers penned down at Fredericksburg, or to be one of those Confederate soldiers who knew they were going to die on Pickett's charge, and then the stories that come out of that. And so much of the book, the central character of the book, Robert Ableson, he is a man who is revered in his own time and he is a hero of the Second World War. He has a very long and distinguished career as a litigator, arguing a host of civil rights issues successfully. But then when he is brought back to live in a time that's not his own, he finds himself unable to keep up with the evolution of history and the evolution of social norms. And so it's really about, this novel is also about how we judge each other across time and how history judges us. And as you mentioned, there's a moment in the book where a fictional Shelby Foote is signing a copy of his book, A Narrative History of the Civil War, which has, become a pretty controversial book, but he signs it to one of the characters. Remember, history is what the living think of the dead. And I think there's some truth in that.
Finally. Yeah, we'll leave the Civil War in a second to go back to the real other aspects of the book. But one of the things you mentioned actually twice in the book is after, it's like a football coach going, wasn't these guys, it's all on me. Mm-hmm. We lost, but wasn't they that lost, it was me. So talk about what Lee thought afterwards and what he said to his men.
Well, that's what Robert E. Lee. So after Pickett's charge, as I mentioned, it was because of the experience they had, fighting throughout the previous years. There were many of Lee's subordinates who did not want him to make that charge and thought it was a bad idea. And Robert E. Lee thought that, this one charge would work, that his army had been very successful in the past, and one last push would give them victory. And then he, in a relatively short amount of time, this charge took place over basically about an hour. His entire army was pretty handily routed and destroyed. And as the remnants of it came sort of staggering back across that field, he rode out on his horse to meet them and said, "It's not your fault. This is my fault. This is me. This is all my fault." And he actually found Pickett on the field, and he told General Pickett, he said, "Assemble all of your men, your remaining men to be ready for a Union counterattack." So he said, "Assemble your division." And Pickett said to him, "Sir, I have no division," meaning he just seen, all of his soldiers massacred. And, historically, famously, Pickett held a grudge against Robert E. Lee, to the day that he died, for having in his eyes, his division slaughtered on the last day at Gettysburg. So, I just think these are all they're war stories, and I think we see the whole scope of humanity in war, and and they're stories about our country that we tell and keep retelling ourselves and re-understanding, because they're woven into the firmament of who we are.
Yeah, it's funny because when you mentioned the Greek root of Halcyon, you can think back to, you can go back as far as you want. You can go back to Troy and Achilles and Hector, and you still have that same mythological thing that you talk about in the book, this concept of myth. And we seem to love it, and we seem to enjoy talking about the bravery, the hubris, the tragedy, cowardice. It's something that resonates with us.
The details, it's one of the interesting things about wars. The details change, but the story stays the same. And you can see all of this type of, folly, as you said, folly and hubris throughout the eons in war. And it's something that thematically, the Halcyon gets at as a novel.
I know. It's like war is hell. I love the smell of napalm in the morning. It's so weird to me because I haven't been involved in any of that. Mm-hmm. All right, let's go. I sorry I do this. One thing you say is, and it really struck me because you said that caricature freezes. And I thought about that because I was just thinking about Biden falling on the stage a couple of weeks ago, or Trump saying Yosemite, or saying he's a stable genius. And I thought about how caricature does freeze things now, more so. I'm not even getting into AI or any of that, but those moments. And then it's funny because I asked my son-in-law this morning, I said, I like to ask people questions before an interview. And I said, so what do you think, like if you had a vote for Gore or Bush? So I didn't really like either of them. Gore being so wooden, which you portrayed beautifully, and Bush being a nitwit. And he goes, well, it's like the Kennedy-Nixon debate. And I said, that's exactly what the author talks about. So yeah, talk about that. Talk about the fictional debate that you create. It just like, and you say like Nixon sweating, which is what Mike just told me.
Well, the reason I set the book in this sort of alternate 2004 is I think if we look back right now in 2023, that's about as close as you can get to the present moment while still considering it history. And I think it's a time that, at least for most readers, will feel at least somewhat recognizable and familiar. But it's a moment where our country really is sort of at a crossroads. And I think, as Americans, we are a nation where sort of reinvention and imagination is built into our DNA, because not for all of us, but for so many of us, our ancestors came to this country and reinvented themselves. My people are from, at least on my father's side, are all European Jews from Ukraine, and they came here at the turn of the 20th century and reinvented themselves. So as such, I think there is this fascination with reinvention, but then also this fascination with alternate history, like this imagining what might have happened, had in the case of, the 2000 election, had about 600 people in Florida voted differently. It would have taken our country in a very different direction. And I gestured to that early in the book. And then I also think one of the seminal events that we have in our history is what we were just talking about, the Civil War. I think one of the reasons Americans are, one of many reasons we're endlessly fascinated with the Civil War, is that each battle that you read about, or each moment of consequence in that war, had it gone the other way, maybe the South would have won and we would live in this like incredibly unrecognizable reality, but it didn't. But there's always that sort of flirtation. It's almost like a flirtation with disaster, had it gone the other way. So I think that the debates that you're talking about, I sort of in the novel, going on in the background is the 2004 presidential election, which is a rematch between Gore and Bush. And I have the debates going on in a couple moments, just because those are real moments of consequence always in American political life. Like, most voters don't really start paying attention until the debates in a meaningful way. And so I wanted to show one of these moments of consequence in the debate, and I won't spoil it, but you see Gore debating Bush, and you see that the debate, kind of who wins it, hinges on something that is relatively superficial, at least as superficial as you mentioned, when the Nixon-Kennedy debate, where Nixon started sweating profusely, and many people felt that was when he lost the debate, because it was the first televised debate, and he was a hot mess. So
yeah, I mean, people say if it had been on the radio, Nixon actually won the debate.
Yes.
And since you went back to the Civil War, the one thing that you really made clear to everybody is this idea of one death by friendly fire, and how that made all the difference, or could have. So talk about that, and then we'll be done with the Civil War.
Sure. So I think one of the great alternate histories of the Civil War is one of, Lee had generally had three deputies, and one of them was Stonewall Jackson. And Stonewall Jackson had a reputation of being a very, very aggressive, very sort of, forward in the saddle, for lack of a better term, commander. And in May of 1863, which is a little more than a month before the Battle of Gettysburg, the Army of Northern Virginia, Lee's army, wins this pretty unexpected and spectacular victory against the North at the Battle of Chancellorsville. And the night after that victory, Stonewall Jackson rides out from his lines, and he's doing a reconnaissance, because they're thinking about doing a night attack to keep the North in retreat. And as he's riding back in from this reconnaissance into his own friendly lines, one of his Confederate sentries opens fire on him, thinking that he's a Northern soldier. And he's shot in the arm, and within a few days, he contracts pneumonia and he dies. So one of the great alternate histories of the Civil War has been, what if Stonewall Jackson had been at Gettysburg? Because early on in the Gettysburg battle, when the Southern soldiers show up at the battlefield, there was a hill called Culp's Hill, and it turned out to be a very key piece of terrain. And Stonewall Jackson's replacement wasn't sure whether or not he was supposed to take Culp's Hill. So he sent a runner to Lee's headquarters saying, what do you want me to do? And the general said, take the hill if, and the word is famously, if practicable. And that commander interpreted that as, no, I don't think I can do it. Whereas historians look back and be like, everything we knew about Jackson is if he had gotten that message, he definitely would have run up that hill. And so many historians have played with this idea, well, had Jackson not been shot at Chancellorsville and killed, then he would have been at Gettysburg. Then the South would have taken Culp's Hill. If they held Culp's Hill, they would have won at Gettysburg. They want to get, and you can imagine this entire chain of events creates this a totally different American reality. Now, I'm sitting here telling you that, based off of my historic expertise, that's absolutely what would have happened. No, I'm not. The point I'm making is that we as Americans seem to have a proclivity for these types of thought experiments, because I think intuitively understand that so much of our existence is based off of creating realities out of what we've imagined. And alternate realities sometimes become very tempting for us to engage in, because they allow us to conceive of a totally different America for good and certainly for ill. I'm very glad that the North won.
Yeah, I mean, it's like that is so relevant to like the past month, 2
Right.
months with simulation theses, and it's so incredibly relevant. It's
in
funny.
very politically volatile times, so I think we are all doing that, in our own little ways with events.
Yeah, even the indictment.
Right.
Yeah, it's
I'm
exactly.
sure many voters have asked themselves, what if James Comey hadn't come out right before the election and said what he said? We're sort of perpetually doing this. And so in the novel, I gesture to that and play with the idea of alternate histories being a very significant and driving force in American life and in the American political imagination.
Yeah, so with Stonewall Jackson, and again, I'll say this is the end. Yeah, he would have I'm not going to use graphic language, but yeah, he would have taken the hill, because he's like Muhammad Ali. Impossible is nothing,
Right. That's what he was sort of known for.
It's exactly what it is. So anyway, so let's go to Martin and back to Robertson, because if you read the New York Times review of this, which is a great review and should read it, it says that Martin is kind of a Nick Carraway and Robertson is kind of a Gatsby, because the Times likes to do that kind of stuff.
Right.
But the thing about it is that, what am I going to say this? Martin is, in my opinion, kind of a dweeb. I don't know if you meant him to be a dweeb. Is he a dweeb?
No, I did. He's a dweeb.
Okay. I wasn't sure if I was like crossing.
No, you're not offending me. He's, I wanted to create, but I think the analogy is right, that he has a little bit of a Nick Carraway to Robert Abelson's Gatsby. When he meets Abelson, the way they become friends is Martin is working on a book, his first book, which he's struggling to finish, in Abelson's guest house. And in the evenings, Abelson comes by as he's walking around his property, and they have martinis and they just talk. And to Martin, Abelson is a character of interest, someone he knows has led a much more distinguished life than he seems to be on track to be leading. So he is sort of, great, in the same way as the Great Gatsby was great, but he's a cipher. And as we learn more about Abelson, we sort of see that, he isn't everything that he would appear to be. And when you meet Martin, I would say his sort of social esteem, for you as the reader, is sort of down here, and Abelson's is sort of up here, but they kind of start doing this over the course of the book. And Martin is the one who unravels many of Abelson's secrets.
But, and one thing first, so no spoilers at all, but there's 2 ways that authors end their books. And some of them, and I've said this many times in interviews, and my brother loves books like this. They put them in a box, they wrap them up, they put a ribbon on it, and that's it. You put it away. I mean, that's it. Whereas there's other books, which are the books I like, where at the end you're going, what? And then you can do the same thing we've been talking about the whole time, is that you create your own alternate history afterwards, because you're not there anymore, right?
Yes. Yeah, I would offer that the book ends on a note that allows you, the reader, to interpret the story.
Exactly.
And wonder a little bit what the last thing was that you saw.
Yeah. I read it in one sitting, and then it was like at 2:00 in the morning. I put it down and I go, damn. I thought I was going to know something different, or no, in a good way.
Yeah.
And then I just sat and thought and created my own varied alternate histories of the multiverse, the Spider-Verse.
Yes.
So yeah, it's like, oh, that's another question. You did an alternate history. Why did you not do the genre du jour of dystopia? Because every book I'm looking at in the store that's selling like crazy is a dystopia. You could have done that just as well.
Well, my alternate America is a little bit. I mean, it's a little bit of a dystopia. It's not quite as maybe dark as some of the.
It's not a zombie apocalypse.
Right. I feel like some of the dystopians out there, they're all trying to outdo each other for how dystopic they can get. But it's like it's a gentle dystopia, in so much as America today is a little bit of a dystopia. Or if you were to parachute someone into America from, many, many years ago, there'd be lots of what's going on in our life today that would seem, I think, somewhat frightening to them. One of the comments since the book's come out is people that have said to me, and I've had, great, it's always fun when a book comes out, because then it's walking around outside of your imagination, is in the opening sentences of the book, the story announces that, the book opens with news of the great discovery had leaked out. New life was now a scientific resurrection was now a scientific possibility. So we announced in the opening pages of the book that death has been cheated. We figured out how to cheat death for all times. And the reaction is not panic in the streets and massive social upheaval. Really, it's, people sort of shrug and they kind of have to go about their lives and figure out what this new technology means. And I actually don't think that is that far off. I mean, we've just in the last 6 months been told that computer brains are going to overtake our brains, and that all music, art, literature will now be generated just as effectively by computers in the next 10 years. And what are we all doing about it? We're just sort of being forced to go about our lives. And I think that the ability of just people to carry on in the face of seismic change is profound. It's sort of what we've always done, dystopic or not. So that's why I would say the book is that's certainly an alternate history, but it's one where there's sort of a gentle dystopia going on.
It's funny, like in the beginning when Robertson's talking about, it's not religious, but he talks about why, might as well go ahead and believe in it. I thought, oh, this is great. I'm going to surprise Elliot with how smart I am and talk about Pascal's wager. And damn, 100 pages later, there it's all laid out completely. And I said, that screws up that would have been a great question. So talk about Pascal's wager, because some people don't know about it.
Well, Pascal's wager is just sort of showing you Pascal was a French philosopher, and he came to the conclusion with regards to the question of whether or not a person should believe in God and the afterlife and be religious. And his logic was, well, if I don't believe and ardently don't believe, and there is an afterlife, I will be punished in the afterlife for not believing. But if I do believe through my whole life and there is no afterlife, I don't lose anything. And if I do believe and there is an afterlife, then I have a massive, wonderful paradise to gain. So he's like, so based off just that logic, the logic of Pascal's wager is you have nothing to lose and everything to gain by believing in God and believing in an afterlife. So that is his logic of belief. And so what you see is Ableson early in the book kind of applies that logic of Pascal's wager to his decision to invest in cryoregeneration, which is the technology that allows him to come back to life. So that is sort of how Pascal's wager and the logic around it features into the logic of the story.
Have you ever been able to try to adopt Pascal's wager? I mean, I've actually tried. It's like, so you can't do it because if you're a smart person, you can't do it, right?
Well, it's tough. It reminds me a little bit of that one episode of Seinfeld where George decides every instinct he's had in life has been wrong and taken him to the wrong place. So he decides to do the opposite and his life starts going really well. So
And he picks up that really,
philosophy of life are always tricky.
and he picks up that really hot girl at the diner.
Yeah, in the deli.
Yeah.
Yeah, by going up to her and saying, "My name is George Costanza, I'm unemployed, and I live with my parents."
Still like the best show ever, except for Curb Your Enthusiasm, which is this show.
Yeah, that's
But-
pretty good.
So in the event that, you know what, we're the problem with you guys, stand-up comedians, Saturday Night Live, is you can no longer caricature, you can no longer satirize. Just like they just read Trump's NFT thing. You don't have to do anything. You just read it and the comedy is there. Or the interview with Sarah Palin. There's nothing you need to do except, so where is that taking us? Because if satire is not available to lampoon these people, what's happening?
Well, I think it shows that I think where we are at right now is a moment in our country that would seem kind of unimaginable even 10, 15, 20 years ago. There's definitely a bizarreness in American life right now. And it seems that social mores are just getting broken more and more and more quickly with only increasing degrees of escalation. And so it leads us to the question of, where are we going to be in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years as a country? And it makes it tough as a novelist to keep up, which is frankly one of the reasons why I set this book in the past. I wanted to set it in a past that felt like our present, but wasn't our present, because I think to write into the present moment, particularly in a novel, particularly in a way that, that deals with politics, is it just didn't feel to me like it would make it as good of a story.
My colleague at the bookstore, he's been there 7 years now. For 7 years, we've been saying, you couldn't make this stuff up. But I can't keep saying it. I just keep saying it over and over and over again. And it gets worse and worse and worse. You couldn't make a movie out of it. You couldn't make a novel out of it, which is the kind of thing I'm saying. But is this what happens to all empires? Yeah, I mean, I don't know. You're the historian kind of in this. So is this what happens?
Well, I think there's probably an argument to be made that the American empire has perhaps entered its decadent phase. I remain a consummate optimist. I think, America, we've been in tough places before. We've figured our way out of it. But we're certainly in a tough place right now. We have yet to figure our way out of it. In terms of just, the fractiousness that exists in our society, I would say the struggles we're having with agreeing on a common truth and a common, even just a common set of facts, not even a common narrative. I mean, there's always been divergent narratives in American life, but, we're having a hard time even agreeing on basic facts. So, for America to kind of, I think, pull itself out of this moment, we need to find some areas of mutual agreement in our American family. And it's one of the reasons why I'm in Halcyon. I'm interested in this. And in all of my writing, there's I don't know if you've had this experience, but in my family, with my kids, I'll tell my kids a story, hey guys, remember the time we blah, 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 blah. And as my kids get older, they're like, Dad, it didn't happen that way. What are you talking about? This is how it happened. We tell ourselves stories, and there's disagreement about the stories in our own families. The same thing can be said of our communities and our country. There's disagreement as to what the story is. And so much of the book wrestles with, what is the true story of many of these events? And is it possible to ever settle on a true story? And different characters in this novel kind of come out on different sides of those questions.
It's Father's Day, so my kids and all my grandkids are here now. I told them to keep quiet. But they've already done that to me 6 times this morning. Dad, that didn't happen that way. You always do this, Dad. It didn't happen. Right. The other one they do is, if I do, you can see the way I am. If I do something, they go, okay, stop, Dad. No, Dad, seriously, stop. And it's like, it's like, yeah, what happened to my myth? I mean, the man, the myth, the legend. I don't have that
And
anymore.
they fade away and they change, and the book is a book about change too. And what endures and what gets taken away, and how a person who is deemed very honorable in their own time, when they try to come back and walk through another time, it doesn't work the same way.
Yeah, but I mean, does Martin change? As the reader, I'm thinking, no, I don't think he did. But did he? A little bit?
I think he ends the book. He begins the book more certain of things, and he ends the book less certain. And I think his change is not that he comes up with answers, but he finds in himself the humility to be asking a bunch of questions. And that's the reason why the book doesn't end necessarily with an answer. It ends with sort of broader questions. In my mind. But people read. That's one of the great things about writing books, is they go out. You finish them, you publish them, and they go and they walk out in the world. And people, I can't tell you how many times I've had people come up to me and tell me something about my book that is clearly in the book that I didn't really see the connection when I was writing the book.
I interviewed an author. He's very famous. I won't say his name. And I did the Terry Gross question. So what's your book about? It's the stupidest question in the world. And he sat there and didn't say anything. And then we had a pause. And he said to me, well, what was my book about?
Yeah. it's the two-liner, the one-liner of what your book about, I think, is the most difficult question to answer as a writer, because there's just always a lot in it.
It's a dumb question. Who are you? It's like, who are you?
Yeah, I don't always know how to answer those questions, because by definition, if you're going to say what the book is about in one sentence, you wouldn't have written a 300 odd page book.
Yeah, it would have been flash fiction.
Yeah, it would have been a sentence.
I wrote a 6-word flash fiction thing. It was called Apocalypse, and it was like, I thought it was all over, because apocalypse, going back to the Greek, it's the end. You can't have a post-apocalyptic novel because it's already all ended. Right?
Exactly. Right. And it wasn't really the apocalypse.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
You see how easily I get away from actually doing anything for you in these interviews, like trying to sell your book.
I'm enjoying the conversation.
Yeah, so definitely, I always enjoy talking to you. Well, so if Martin is the Nick, and Martin creates, he's our, is Martin an unreliable narrator? There's a good one. That's a Terry Gross question.
I think he's an unreliable narrator in the way that any first-person narrator is an unreliable narrator, because they infect what they're telling you with their own biases, and they have a limited perspective, as opposed to some type of omniscient authorial narrator. But I think in Halcyon, he's reliable in that he tells you who he is pretty quickly, warts and all. I mean, you see him, you see his personal situation, which is not great. I mean, he's a recent divorcee. He's professionally, less than super successful, kind of struggling to make it. And he's seeing his peers like Lucas Harlow and others sort of speed past him, both in their professional and personal lives. So he's someone who is struggling with the narrative of his own life when you meet him, and his friendship with Ableson is, this is sort of an older mentor figure for him, but he quickly, I think, sees that his mentor has some complications in his own history, and so they wind up going from sort of mentor-mentee to equals and friends.
Yeah, I would say he's self-deprecating, but it's more than that, especially when he's talking about, without spoiling anything, he's basically talking about what a lousy husband is and why did she even pick him in the first place. It's
right.
Personal self-deprecation. But yeah, but as we wind down, I guess, to me, the most important question is the book, what I raised in the introduction, is I do have this ambivalence, especially since I watch these things being torn down along the main street, whatever that street's called in Richmond. Yeah, I have this ambivalence. like when they took down the stocks in Connecticut because they were 90% used to punish Black people. So they took them down. But then you can't remember as a child, your parent can't take you there and say, this was what they did. We should never do that again. So once you take down these monuments and put them in a place you put them in, they're gone. And how do you feel about that?
I think that first of all, this is like, these are real questions. Like, these are real questions about history, the place of history, and remembering, and what we hold on to and what we let go of. And there's no easy answer to that. I think the only answer is to continue to ask the questions and to continue to interrogate the story that we are telling ourselves. So on the one hand, I'm very sympathetic and completely understand it. Like, let's say you're living in New Orleans, where until recently there was a huge statue of Robert E. Lee on top of a column in the middle of the city, that the residents of New Orleans were like, hey, like, we don't feel like 150 years later, we want to be walking past this every single day. Like, let's put something else here, and they get rid of it. Like, I'm sympathetic to that. People, these are living spaces. I think it gets much more complicated when we start talking about the spaces that are not for the living, but the spaces that are for the dead. And when I say spaces for the dead, I mean battlefields, which is a space that I treat in the book about the Virginia Monument. And I won't spoil it, but the Virginia Monument gets sort of different treatment in my book than it has gotten in real life. And then cemeteries. And I write in the book pretty exclusively about Arlington National Cemetery, which I think is just, in our American story, is a fascinating piece of ground. I mean, Arlington National Cemetery is like our most hallowed ground in this country. I don't think a lot of people know that the history behind the cemetery is it was built on the site of the Custis Lee Mansion, right across the Potomac from Washington, D.C. So that's basically Robert E. Lee's wife, who was a great-granddaughter of George Washington. It was their family home. So when the Civil War started, they had to leave Custis House and go further south. And about 3 years into the war, as dead Union soldiers kept coming back through Washington, D.C., they ran out of space in the city to bury the dead soldiers. So Lincoln went to the quartermaster general of the Union Army, a guy named Meigs, said, hey, I need you to find some space for a cemetery. And Meigs' own son had been killed a few months before fighting for the North. And so Meigs, as sort of an act of revenge, said, I know where we'll bury all of our dead. We'll bury them at the Custis House in Mrs. Lee's rose garden, so she can never return home. So it was sort of this perfect act of enmity. But then just to finish, one of the things that I think it becomes really complicates this is that many people don't know there are 482 dead Confederate soldiers buried at Arlington National Cemetery. And there is we talk about Confederate War Memorials. There's a Confederate War Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery, the Holy of Holies. The thing that's different about those Confederate graves is, unlike all of the American graves, ours are buried in rows, so you can always add to them. The Confederates are buried in concentric circles, so you cannot add to them. But the question, and it's one that exists in American life today, is, okay, well, what do we do with those graves? And the reason those Confederate soldiers were buried there was they were buried there at the end of the 1800s during the Spanish-American War, because then 30 plus years at the end of the Civil War, there was this question when the Spanish-American War started, which, oh, by the way, was a war, American colonial expansion. It was, will the South fight with the North again? And many Southerners were like, we're not going to fight with you. So the president, McKinley at the time, as a gesture to the South, said, we would like your Confederate soldiers to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery because we respect them and the like. And that's why those graves are there. But the question becomes, if we were to tear down every single monument and wipe it all out, you would be digging up those graves in Arlington and moving those dead bodies. And so the question in the book is sort of, I think it becomes a bit of a metaphor, is, even with bodies and ideas, even when you start digging them out of the earth, what do? They start walking around amongst the living. And where does that take us? So these are, you asked me what I think. What I think is that there aren't just really easy solutions to all of this. There's, it's subjective. It's sort of it's situationally, I think, probably going to be situationally dependent. And the decisions we make they say a lot about us as a society and the type of society we're going to create going forward and the types of stories we're going to tell about ourselves going forward.
Yeah, and what you just did is you gave us an amalgam of what a story is. It's almost like a metaphor of red dress and black and white. There's three colors here.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, okay, where do you draw the line? And is there really a line? I mean, Thomas Jefferson had slaves. Do we cancel him? Woodrow Wilson was whatever. Henry Ford was anti-Semitic. Lindbergh, Francis Scott Key. Should we cancel the national anthem or not listen to it anymore because he was whatever he was? And so that's caricature. So this idea of, so you've created this, you just told us a story about what really happened and why they're in a circle and why they're there at all and whose ground they're on. But the lay person or the person who, I can't use the right words because I can't say them. Not because they're dirty words, but because they become words that mean things. For example, Karen. But so for the people who just are following, whether they're death threats to J.K. Rowling because she said something that was totally logical. So, and then you just talked about AI, which is going to make things worse. So you're an optimist. I'm a total fatalist.
Well, I'm an optimist. So I can't afford not to be an optimist. I think, listen, what if you ask me where I come down on one thing, I think the one thing the book rejects is simplicity. And the thing that the book embraces is complexity. People are complex. Our history is complex. If you to pretend that the story of humanity is not a story of incredible complexity is to elide the truth. The truth is complexity. For everyone, for our heroes, for our villains, it's complexity. Someone can still be a hero and be complex. Someone can still be a villain and be complex. But if we turn our backs on complexity, we're turning our backs on the truth.
Yeah. I was just thinking, when we're talking about Martin, the most pivotal moment in Martin's metamorphosis, which it really isn't, but in the book, in the arc of the book, is when, again, without spoiling, because I won't, is when he picks up the dime and moves the dime.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I have like 1,000 more questions, but we've been going an hour. It's always great talking to you because
it's great talking to you too.
You always put up with me.
No, this has been fun. This has been fun, and thank you for your engagement with the book.
Thank you. Talk to you again soon. Maybe next year or after.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. Bye-bye.
All right, Tyson, bye-bye.